Good afternoon, church. Good to see everybody back here. 5 o'clock service to pick up where we left off in our part 2 lesson from this morning. Before I begin, I just want to share with everybody, a lot of you have been asking me just about how Arthur's doing this afternoon. Well, he slept most of the afternoon. And when he woke up, he did have a slight fever of 100 degrees. And so I'll be taking him over to the Choctaw Clinic tomorrow if they have an opening available. And so just continue to keep him in your prayers. And I really appreciate everybody's love and support and letting me know that they've been thinking about Arthur. And it really means a lot to me. If you have your Bibles, please open them to Matthew chapter 5. We're going to pick up at verse 31, where we left off. Kind of give just a brief recap or review of this morning. Jesus had been discussing in verse 27 through 30 about mental adultery. Adultery that is committed within the heart, based upon having lust for another person who is another person's mate within the heart. And we talked about how we ought to avoid adultery, and the way to do that is, number one, is to protect our heart and mind. We need to cast out anything that is causing us to commit lustful intent on another person. Whether it be social media, whether it be movies, television programs, books, magazines that we read, we need to rip them out and cast them far away as we possibly can. Jesus says it's not worth losing your soul, your eternal salvation, for the lust of the eyes. But then, after talking about mental adultery, verse 31 and 32, we see that Jesus is now going to approach what some might call legalized adultery. Some think these verses are a separate contrast, but since they continue Jesus' discussion about adultery, let's go ahead and consider these two verses now. It was also said, whoever divorces his wife, let him give her a certificate of divorce. But I say to you that everyone who divorces his wife, except on the ground of sexual immorality, makes her commit adultery, and whoever marries a divorced woman commits adultery. What we see here is that not only are we to protect our heart and our mind from mental adultery, we need to protect our home and marriage from legalized or physical adultery. And notice how once we have a protection on our heart and our mind, it will keep us from committing the actual act, because it all begins in the heart and in the mind. But we also need to protect our home and our marriage, because notice what Jesus is saying. He first, once again, reflects back on what it is that they have heard or what they have been taught by the scribes, Pharisees, and Sadducees. He says, it was also said, whoever divorces his wife, let him give her a certificate of divorce. Now, this is not an exact quotation from an Old Testament passage, but it is based on a passage from the Old Testament, Deuteronomy chapter 24, verse 1 through 4. And divorce was allowed in Jewish circles, and it involved giving the woman a legal certificate of divorce. This legal certificate of divorce in Hebrew was called a get. That's how you pronounce it, the Hebrew word for it, get. And the man who's wanting to give his wife a get, a certificate of divorce, he gives it to the woman and places it in her hand, so that when she strikes up a conversation with another man, she is required to give to that other man that certificate. The document protected her from being an adulteress if she were to get remarried. That is what the Pharisees, the Sadducees, and the scribes were teaching the people at the time. They were abusing Deuteronomy chapter 24, verses 1 through 4 during Jesus' day. Because according to the Mishnah, once again, Mishnah, as we talked about this morning, was one of the scholarly books that the Pharisees and Sadducees enjoyed teaching the people, and they based the Mishnah and the Talmud more authoritative than God's own law. All because of what these highly elite, scholarly, smart, academic rabbis were teaching. And in the Mishnah, which is the oral traditions of those ancient scholarly rabbis, one rabbi wrote the following: receive a get, and you are free to marry any man. In other words, what they taught was that divorce all you want, just give her a certificate. Wow. Let me ask you this. Doesn't our own United States of America, isn't that how they treat divorce as well? As long as you go to court and get a divorce finalized, you can go ahead and marry any other person that you want. Well, this has been going on since the time of Jesus as well. Jesus says, no, do not do this. Think about what it does to the woman. What does Jesus say? Because remember, what the Pharisees and Sadducees are teaching the people is this. Well, Rabbi so-and-so said this. Rabbi so-and-so said that. Rabbi so-and-so said that. Rabbi so-and-so said that. Finally, Jesus says, I say unto you. And this is what makes the Sermon on the Mount so powerful, because if you jump towards the end of it, look at verse 28 of chapter 7. 28, 29. When Jesus finished these sayings, talking about the Sermon on the Mount, the crowds were astonished at his teaching, for he was teaching them as one who had authority, and not as one of the scribes. That is the difference between Jesus' teaching and that of the scribes and Pharisees. They were more concerned about what the smart, educated, highly elite scholars, rabbis had to say, but Jesus says, I say unto you, establishing authority. He is calling us to a higher standard of living, a higher spirituality than that of the scribes and Pharisees. And what higher standard or spirituality is that? The righteousness of God. Only the righteousness of God, based on his standard that we have right here, is the only righteousness that can change you inside and out. What did Jesus teach? He said, I say unto you that everyone who divorces his wife, except on the ground of sexual immorality, makes her commit adultery, and whoever marries a divorced woman commits adultery. Here in the text, Jesus is approaching this from the angle of the woman's point of view or the woman's perspective. It forces her into survival mode where she will most likely try to remarry. Unlike today, women did not have any possibilities of being successful in the business world. The culture of the first century placed women on needing to be relied on the provisions of her husband for success. And since her divorce was not on the grounds of adultery, then if she were to remarry, she would be guilty of adultery. The man who married her would also be guilty of adultery because she is not eligible for remarriage. This shows and proves that every marriage bond cannot be broken by a certificate of divorce. In the government's eyes, it might, but in the eyes of God, it's not. And this is what I was talking about earlier this morning, about how in society, in our nation, in the world today, that we have forgotten about the sanctity of marriage. It's not based upon a piece of paper. It's based upon a covenant relationship that you and the one you want to spend with the rest of your life and with God. That is a covenant relationship. And yet we think that just because we tend to have it branded within our minds as human beings, that just because it says a marriage license, Mr. and Mrs. So-and-so, we think that certificate itself tells us that we're married. No, it does not. God tells you that you're married. It's all based upon the sanctity and the covenant of marriage, the way that God has designed it since the very beginning. So the question a lot of people ask is, okay, well then why? Why did God give the certificate of divorces in the Old Testament? Once again, Jesus has an answer to this. Jump with me, hold your place in Matthew 5, jump with me to chapter 19 of Matthew. Matthew chapter 19, beginning at verse 7 and 8. They said to him, this is the Pharisees, why then did Moses command one to give a certificate of divorce and to send her away? Jesus said to them, because of your hardness of heart, Moses allowed you to divorce your wives, but from the beginning it was not so. Here's your answer. Why? Because of the hardness and stubbornness of your hearts. Whether you were allowed to divorce or not, you were going to do it anyway. Because of your stubbornness and hardness of heart. So the certificates of divorce, go back and look at it yourself, were never a command, but a concession. Moses permitted certificates of divorce, hoping that the legislation would discourage them from getting a divorce, because there's at least two aspects of the legislation if somebody wanted to have a divorce. First off, a legal process needed to be there. A legal proceeding was necessary. A husband could not just throw away his wife or just throw her out the door. No, you had to go through a legal process. Secondly, once a man divorced his wife and she remarried, she could never be his wife again. These two aspects were given in hopes to discourage people at that time from getting a divorce. Jesus taught that there is only one exception, though. Only one exception for divorce and remarriage. Go back to Matthew 5. We'll come back to Matthew 19 again, but flip back over to Matthew 5. I always encourage people to read the text for themselves. Don't take my word for it. But the only grounds for divorce and remarriage is on the ground of sexual immorality, Jesus says. The Greek word for sexual immorality is pronounced porneia, which specifically means to have illicit sexual intercourse. And in context, what illicit sexual intercourse is Jesus talking about? Well, in context, all the way back to verse 27, adultery. That is the illicit sexual intercourse that Jesus is talking about in the context, is adultery, marital unfaithfulness. Therefore, it would be scripturally acceptable for a righteous man to put away his wife for marital unfaithfulness and choose to remarry if he so wishes. Now, jump ahead to Matthew 19 again. It's going to be a back and forth thing. Jesus here in verse 9 repeats what he stated back in chapter 5, verse 31 and 32. It says, and I say to you, there's that authority again, whoever divorces his wife except for sexual immorality and marries another commits adultery. A couple things I want you to notice here. Notice what the text says. And I say unto you, whoever. Other versions may say, if any man, any Whoever. What does this apply to, or who does it apply to then? Everybody universally. Because a lot of people tend to often think that, well, I mean, they weren't Christians before, so if they obey the gospel and have their sins washed away, then aren't their sins forgiven? Can't they go ahead and continue to stay in that unscriptural marriage? No. Because here in Matthew 19, verse 9, Jesus says, any man, non-Christian or Christian, it applies to everybody, universally speaking. And also, Paul goes on to say in Romans chapter 6, verse 1, should we continue in sin? If you're living in sin in an unscriptural marriage, is God's grace going to abound? Paul says no. God forbid. Should we continue in sin so that grace may abound? Absolutely not. May God forbid. So yeah, if they become Christians and they realize that their marriage is an unscriptural marriage, they need to get out of sin. They need to end it. The man who foolishly and unscripturally divorces his wife, who has not committed adultery, gets the ball rolling on two other sins. Going back to our text of Matthew 5, 31 and 32. Let's say a man who divorces his wife unscripturally, one for no reason, for a reason that's not because of adultery, he gets the ball rolling on two other sins. Notice what the text says in Matthew 5, 31 and 32. He says, first off, he makes her commit adultery when she goes into survival mode by remarrying another man. And secondly, the man who marries that divorced woman commits adultery as well. Think back at the Samaritan woman in John chapter 4, verse 16 through 18. Jesus tells the Samaritan woman, go, call your husband. Tell him to come here. I don't have a husband. Jesus said, you answered correctly. For you've had 5 husbands. And the one you're with now, the husband you're with now, is not your husband. Even if a marriage certificate says it, in God's eyes, it's not. Because if that's the case for the Samaritan woman, that tells us by necessary inference that the reason why she left her first husband was not because of adultery. Well, why'd she have 5 other husbands? Survival mode. You see what it does to her? It does more harm than good. That's why Jesus says, do not do that to your wife. Do not give her a get or a certificate of divorce. The only grounds for divorce and remarriage is if the guilty party commits adultery, marital unfaithfulness. But then people ask, what about an abusive marriage? What if a woman has to go into survival mode in the sense of getting out of a physical abusive marriage? Well, remember what Jesus is talking about. Divorce and remarriage. If a married couple were to divorce, not because of adultery, then they only have 2 options. Hold your place here. I want you to see it for yourself. And jump with me to 1 Corinthians chapter 7. 1 Corinthians chapter 7. Verse 10 and 11, Paul says, to the married, I give this charge. Not I, but the Lord. This is a commandment from the Lord. The wife should not separate from her husband. But if she does, she should remain unmarried or else be reconciled to her husband. And the husband should not divorce his wife. You have 2 options. If a married couple, were decided to divorce, not because of adultery, Paul says you only got 2 options. Remain single for the rest of your life, or be reconciled to your first spouse. And that word separate, where it says right there, the wife should not separate, translators did a very bad job. Because that Greek word is the same Greek word for divorce and Matthew 5, 31 and 32, and Matthew 19, verse 9. Same Greek word. So again, if that were to happen, not because of adultery, 2 options only. Remain single for the rest of your life, or else be reconciled. And a lot of people, this is a tough pill to swallow. But that's not fair. I was in an abusive relationship, physically. Well, whether if it was the man getting abused, because that happens, or if it was the woman getting physically abused, this all goes back to why we need to take marriage seriously.
Amen.
This is why we need to remember about the sanctity and the covenant of marriage. A lot of problems that arise nowadays is because of poor choices that people have made. Which is why young people and youth, that's why the older folks here in the church always try to encourage you to marry someone in the faith, in the church. Because it's not wise to be unequally yoked. God's original plan for marriage. Well, before we get that, I want to answer another argument that people often make. Well, does not God hate divorce? Malachi chapter 2, verse 16. Yes, he does. God hates divorce, period. I hate divorce, period. I'm sure I can speak for my brothers and sisters here as well, that we all hate divorce, period. It's an ugly thing. But also given the text of Malachi chapter 2, when you look at the 2 verses before it, verse 14 and 15, God gives a reason why he hates divorce. Because it destroys and damages, does collateral damage to the children in the home. It destroys the lives of the offspring. And if you do studies and statistics on how many crimes are committed by men or women who grew up in broken homes, it is high. Divorced homes bring collateral damage to the lives of the children. That is why God hates divorce. God's original plan for marriage was to be one man and one woman for life, and the Pharisees, Sadducees, and scribes were ruining that principle. And our nation today is ruining that principle as well. So what is it that we need to do as a church, as Christians? What is it that we need to understand and do? Well, it goes back to what I've repeatedly said. We need to remember and understand and honor and take seriously the sanctity and covenant of marriage. But here's a good practical things, or practical tips that will help strengthen marriages and homes. We need to give biblical and practical instruction on how married couples can have a godly and love-filled Christian home. If you have your Bibles, I want you to turn to probably the most neglected book in the Old Testament, the Song of Solomon. Song of Solomon, right after Ecclesiastes and before Isaiah. Song of Solomon, and we'll start with chapter 1. Sometimes couples wonder what went wrong in our relationship. These aren't just married couples that are non-Christians, but even married couples who are New Testament Christians. At times they often wondered, maybe to themselves, maybe they shared it privately with their own spouse, or maybe even through marital counseling, they often wondered what went wrong in our relationship. Song of Solomon is such a beautiful book. Really, there's no words to describe this book. It is such a beautiful book, and in fact, I refer to it as God's marriage manual. Sadly, it is the most neglected book in the Bible. But the book is designed to show what marriage ought to look like in God's eyes. This isn't no symbolical, metaphorical type of story or account that you read. This is about a literal love between a man, Solomon, and his wife, the Shulamite woman. And the couple in the book offers several tips which strengthen marriage. First off, we see that the couple are very vocal in expressing how much they think of one another. Words of affection, words of affirmation, and words of assurance. Some say flattery will get you nowhere, but in the song, it works well. And I know for a fact that for the ladies and the wives here, when's it enough for your husband to say, I love you? When's it enough? Never. It's never enough. You want them to keep saying, I love you. Because they are words of affection, words of affirmation and assurance. Well, we see that between the couple here in the Song of Solomon. Look at chapter 1, verse 15 and 16. This is Solomon speaking to her. He says, Behold, you are beautiful, my love. Behold, you are beautiful. He's emphasizing it twice. Your eyes are doves. And in response, she replies, Behold, you are beautiful, my beloved, truly delightful. He tells her twice that she is beautiful. She tells him that he is handsome and pleasant. These words are spoken with genuineness and sincerity. Solomon also gives her words of reassurance when you go back to verse 7 and verse 8 of chapter 1. Here she is, getting a little bit paranoid, maybe a little doubtful. But she says, Tell me, you whom my soul loves, where you pasture your flock, where you make it lie down at noon. For why should I be like one who veils herself beside the flocks of your companions? Verse 8, he responds saying, If you do not know, O most beautiful among women, follow in the tracks of the flock, and pasture your young goats beside the shepherd's tent. Verse 8, Solomon reassures her that she is the only woman he cares about. Oh, most beautiful among women. In verse 7, she has concerns about where he is going and what he will be doing. And he does not chastise her for her seeming lack of trust. I don't need to tell you where I'm going. It's none of your business. Just leave me alone. He does not do that. He lovingly, gently reassures her where he's going. And on top of that, he invites her to come with him. Follow the tracks, and you will find me out there. The couple also demonstrated their love for each other through action. Oh yes, words of affection, assurance, and affirmation are very important. But he also demonstrates his love through action as well. If you jump over to chapter 2, looking at verse 4 through 6 here. In verse 4, we read that the wife fell more in love with her husband because he showed consideration to her feelings. Notice what she says. He brought me to the banqueting house, and his banner over me was love. Why was she so astonished about being at the house banquet? Well, she felt uncomfortable. She felt out of place. Because notice the kind of woman that she is. Go back to chapter 1 real quick, verse 5 and 6. She says, I am very dark, but lovely, O daughters of Jerusalem, like the tents of Kedar, like the curtains of Solomon. Do not gaze at me, because I am dark. She had a low self-esteem of herself. The sun has looked upon me. My mother's sons were angry with me. They made me keeper of the vineyards, but my own vineyard I have not kept. And the wife had a very low self-esteem of herself. She was very dark, and that was not the attraction during that day. Having dark skin did not seem attractive at all. It wasn't the fashion statement at that time. She worked on a farm. She grew up in a rough life. And Solomon, her husband, noticed that she had a low self-esteem of herself. And he did something about it. He scheduled a date night, bringing her to his banqueting hall. He demonstrated to everybody, because at the banquet hall of the king, you have all these guests. And even though that she seemed out of place, what was he telling the guests when he brought her with him? This is my woman. This is the woman that I love. I'm hers and she is mine. He is helping her build her self-esteem up, saying that I don't care if you're dark-skinned. I love you. You are my one and only. And in response, she says, his banner over me is love. He made it clear through his actions that they belong to each other. He made a banquet, a date night, very special and a memorable time for her. Hope y'all are seeing where I'm getting at. Couples also thoroughly need to be aware of the foxes that can destroy their relationship in marriage. In verse 15 of chapter 2, they say to catch the foxes for us, the little foxes that spoil the vineyards, for our vineyards are in blossom. Now, for those who have ever had a vineyard or an orchard or crops on a farm and everything, you know what happens when the foxes get in there, am I right? They eat it. They devour it. They destroy it. Here in the context, the vineyard represents their marital relationship. And Solomon is saying, or the Shulamite woman is saying, catch those foxes that are trying to spoil, devour, and destroy our marital relationship. Catch them. Just like foxes that destroy vineyards, there are many dangers that can sabotage and destroy marriages. In today's world, it could be finances. Finances can destroy many marriages. Or even friends. Friends get caught up in the middle. And they start sticking their nose where it doesn't belong. And they start telling a bunch of lies. Oh, I won't let my man do that to me. You need to find yourself a different man, girl. Well, tell your friends to mind their own business. It's between you and your husband. And husbands, hey, your friends do the same thing as well. All right? Vice versa. It happens vice versa. So it could be friends. It could be alcohol. Alcohol can destroy marriages. Work can destroy marriages when you're putting it before your family. Toxic traits can destroy marriages. Pornography destroys it. Social media, developing feelings for another man or a woman, and etc. All those things can be represented as foxes that can spoil and destroy the vineyard that is your marital relationship. The instruction here is to catch them, to prevent them from damaging a loving relationship. And I'm going to illustrate this real quick, okay? As I mentioned to you this morning, this is a method that I use in my marital counseling sessions. And I can say that credit belongs to Dr. James Dobson. He is a conservative Christian counselor, but more of a denominational counselor, but very conservative in his values. I read this method in one of his books and decided to apply it, and it has been very effective. You have, in a marriage, think of it like a bank account, all right? The husband has his bank account, and the wife has her bank account. The wife makes deposits into the husband's account, and the husband makes deposits into the wife's account. Not with money, but with words of affection, words of affirmation, words of assurance, and action. The husband says to his wife, You amaze me every morning. How am I such a blessed man to wake up to the most beautiful woman that God has blessed me with? What are you doing? The wife says, oh, you made a deposit. She likes it. The wife says to the husband, wow, sweetheart, I know that you've been going to the gym and trying the best you can to lose some weight. Wow, you're doing great. I'm so proud of you. Guess what you're doing? You're making a deposit. Sweetheart, thank you so much for just the wonderful dinner that you made and continue to make for our family each and every night. I know how hard you work, and I thank God every day for you. Thank you for being such an amazing wife to me and such an amazing mom to our kids and such an amazing grandmother to our grandkids. I had a friend of mine who shared a story with me about how he went to go help one of his friends to build a fence about 10 by 10 fence all the way around to kind of form a perfect square. Well, it took a lot of work, but he noticed that as they were going along and building the fence, putting the posts in, his wife would come out about every hour and say, my, the fence is looking good. My, Superman, you're doing a great job. And she went back inside. The husband looked over to him and said, you know what? I think we can get 3 more feet. Yeah, let's do 3 more feet. Yeah. They started working. After 3 more feet of posting and of digging and posting, the wife comes out again. Oh, boy, you keep blowing me away. You're doing such a great job. Man, that fence is looking good. Goes back inside. He looks over and says, yeah, I think we can do 5 more feet. Let's do 5 more feet. And it kept going on and on and on until by the end of the day, they finished it. They finished it completely. And that's a fascinating story and a powerful illustration because as husbands, what do we want to be to our wives? We want to be the hero. We want to be your Superman. And so compliments and comments to your husband, they go a long way. They keep things going. And we love that. And vice versa. Husbands, when you are noticing differences of your wife, whether she got a new dress on or whether she went to get a haircut or decided to put highlights in them, and you notice it and say, wow, I love your new hair. I love that style. I love the highlights. Guess what? Whew. You're making deposits. But here's the danger. What can you also do with the bank account? Withdraw. You say something negative to your wife, withdraw. Say something mean, discouraging to your husband, that's what you're doing. You're withdrawing. Husbands that make compliments from movies. Wow, that woman in there, ooh, she's so attractive and so beautiful. While your wife is sitting next to you, what are you doing? You're making withdrawals. Women, likewise, when you see the Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson in a movie and he gets shirtless in a scene or something like that, whoo, whoo, guess what you're doing? You're making deposits, or withdrawals, excuse me. You're withdrawing. Husbands, when you don't notice any changes that your wife made, whether it's a new haircut, a new hairstyle, or highlights, you don't notice it, she goes off to work. And one of her male colleagues notices it and makes a compliment. Guess what's happening? Someone else is making a deposit into your wife's account. Those are the foxes. Hopefully you get the point of that illustration. That's a method that I share with couples that I counsel, whether they are Christian couples or non-Christian couples. That applies the same. Our lesson has centered on the unsavory topic, adultery, sexual sin, lust, divorce, remarriage. Regarding the sin, the best way to handle it is to avoid it completely. Avoid the lust, avoid the mental adultery, avoid the sexual sins. Avoid it by protecting your heart and your mind, and avoid it by protecting your home and your marriage. If you are struggling with the sin of adultery in any form, mental or physical, or struggling with the lust of it, or with any other sin, and if we can help you, let us know. The invitation is extended for those who've never obeyed the gospel. You have that opportunity tonight. You also have an opportunity for a brother or sister who may be struggling with something that we have discussed and talked about in the lesson this morning and tonight. Well, if you want to make things right with God, you can do so now. Or if you're just struggling with lust and temptation or any issues that you're dealing with, the church family is here for you together as we stand and as we sing.